So welcome everybody. Thank you for your patience. Thanks for being here today. I'm going to hand over to Bec Goode now, and we will fill you in on some more information at the end of the session. Over to you, Bec.
Thank you very much, Nell, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today, and apologies for all of our technical hitches. Technology and myself don't go hand in hand, and I think Nell's been having her own trouble. So between the two of us, I'm very pleased that this seems to be in action now. So thank you for your patience. And before I start, I'd just like to show my respect and ask everyone here to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and the elders past, present and future on which they stand as we participate in this webinar. So I'm here today to talk to you a bit about co-sheltering, which is a particular passion of mine. And I'll kind of start, I think I'll probably just start into my presentation. It's fairly self-explanatory. This came about as a capstone project for my Masters of Science in Shelter Medicine. And I'll explain kind of the processes that I worked through as I did some study into the situation in Australia. Now, I'm just going to turn off my video just for a minute, and I just seem to be having, unfortunately, there we are. Okay, good. All right. So yes, welcome to co-sheltering in Australia, which is really a topic about keeping pets and people together. And just a little bit about me before I start. So my name is Dr. Bec Goode, and I'm a small animal veterinarian practicing in Melbourne. My husband and I started Port Phillip Animal Hospital in 2006, and we do co-own another couple of practices in Melbourne. We've been working to provide vet services to the greyhound adoption program in Victoria for about 10 years, and so we see many retired greyhounds in our practice in Melbourne. Our clinic has really strong connections to welfare organisations in our local community, and we work with groups such as Pets of the Homeless, Pet Medical Crisis, and also our local council to provide access to care for vulnerable people and their pets. In terms of myself, I've recently completed a Masters in Shelter Medicine at the University of Florida, and I'm just starting a certificate in the School of Veterinary Social Work at the University of Tennessee. And on the screen, you can see some photos of the human and non-human animals that share my life, of which there are many, as you can see. So as I take you into this journey on co-sheltering, I wanted to start by giving you a roadmap of where we're going. To start with, I'll discuss the basics of the what, how and why of co-sheltering. And then I'll introduce you to some research that we've recently done in Australia into this topic and some insights of where this initial research might be heading. So I thought we should start with a definition. What exactly do we mean by co-sheltering? The definition that I think sums it up best comes from the organisation My Dog Is My Home, which is a not-for-profit working in the access to care and human-animal bond space, which defines co-sheltering as any arrangement in which animals and people are sheltered together at the same facility in a temporary housing setting. So the types of temporary housing that might co-shelter include crisis or emergency housing for rough sleepers or people suffering temporary housing insecurity, domestic family violence shelters, and disaster response shelters, so pop-up shelters responding to situations of natural disaster such as fire and flood. Sheltering together models can include housing situations where animals are cared for in their owner's room, which is also called in-room care, where animals and people share a space in a dormitory or shared room setting, or where people are cared for in designated animal housing, which is specifically designed kennels, cattery, or runs on the same site or in a different housing unit on the site. Each housing situation has its own unique set of benefits and drawbacks, and the type of care situation may vary due to shelter regulations, because existing facilities have been modified to accommodate animals due to funding, or because facilities are expected to be temporary only, such as the situation in disaster relief shelters. So why co-shelter? The idea of keeping pets and people together, regardless of living situation, is a relatively new one in the field of animal welfare. Traditionally, animal welfare models promoted that animals were removed from situations of risk and housing uncertainty and relinquished to shelters for the opportunity to be rehoused with other families in more secure living situations. Pets owned by the homeless and housing insecure population were seen to be at risk from a welfare perspective. Current understanding of human-animal interactions has changed the goalposts. So upstream thinking has moved beyond the should they or shouldn't they be allowed to have pets bias to an understanding that the reality of this situation in many countries is that levels of pet ownership amongst rough sleepers and housing insecure is relatively high. So up to 10% in the US homeless population, and one British study reports pet ownership of up to 23% in rough sleepers. Not only this, but the pro-welfare argument against pet ownership in the housing insecure population doesn't stand up to scrutiny from a pet wellness perspective. Recent research presented in the Journal of Preventative Veterinary Medicine has shown that this population of pets is equivalent in terms of health status to the general population. A deeper understanding of the human-animal bond has helped us with the idea of pets as non-human family members, with the accompanying need to treat pets and their people as a family unit. Providing services that aim to keep that family unit together thus becomes a priority for both human and animal welfare, and requires collaboration between the social services framework and the animal welfare network. So what are the benefits of co-sheltering for people? Firstly, we know that the number one reason homeless pet owners may refuse to enter emergency accommodation is that they are unable to bring their animals in with them. A Maddie's Fund report documents that a shelter's willingness to accept animals was a critical factor in people's decision to leave the street. So providing animal-friendly spaces is a really important factor to allow people to take advantages of services in their community. Secondly, co-sheltering can remove a barrier faced by victim survivors who need to leave their home and seek safe shelter from abusive relationships. For many domestic violence victims, having to choose safe accommodation but leaving their pets behind is no choice at all. Animals were present in over 70% of reported incidents of domestic family violence in Australia, and violence or threats of violence towards family pets is a common tool used by perpetrators to exert control. Victims will often choose to remain in a situation of risk rather than separate from their pets. One of the main factors in victims of domestic violence remaining in the family home is due to fear of what would happen to their pets if they left. Not only does co-sheltering allow victims to leave in the first place, it can also bring a semblance of normality to a traumatic situation. Living with animals has been shown to have a positive effect on sufferers of post-traumatic stress disorder by reducing negative feelings of worry, loneliness, and depression, and increasing feelings of calmness, positivity, and self-efficacy. For children, this can be really important. Thirdly, co-sheltering supports the human-animal bond and allows the housing insecure and victim survivors to benefit from the therapeutic mechanism of pet ownership. Most people are familiar with the general pet health benefits of pet ownership, such as cardiovascular, increased fitness, social facilitation, and possible reduction in allergen sensitization. So while most of us don't own our pets for the purpose of enhancing our health, this is one of the happy side effects. And it's just as true in marginalised and at-risk groups as it is for the rest of the community. For people experiencing homelessness and trauma, the therapeutic mechanism of the human-animal bond can actually go much deeper. Interviews with homeless pet owners reveal common threads. Pets are described as giving stability and resilience, support and companionship. They can be a reason to seek healthcare, reduce substance abuse, and reduce lapses from sobriety. They can act as a buffer against the real boredom of life on the streets and the loneliness that comes with it. They can be the most meaningful and sometimes only close relationships that some homeless people get to experience. Amongst this cohort, pets are often described as being a reason to live and to avoid suicide. Pets can literally be life-saving for people in these situations. Finally, having animals co-sheltered with their owners can also have emotional and social benefits for non-owners in the shelter environment, promoting a sense of community and well-being for other residents and having a positive effect on staff member morale. Animals as social facilitators is well described, and it works just as well in a sheltering environment as outside of it. So the benefits for people seem clear, but what about for their pets? For families where household violence is a factor, the inability to leave quickly with pets can result in animals being left behind in situations where they are at extreme risk of injury or death. Perpetrators of domestic violence will often use both threats and actual violence towards family pets as tools for coercion. 53% of women seeking help from a domestic family violence specialist service reported abuse of animals, and 46% reported threats of abuse. Animal victims left behind may be unprotected from acts of retribution by the perpetrator in the family. Emergency boarding at shelters and boarding facilities, while temporary, has other potential drawbacks for both the pets in boarding and the general shelter population. Just like people, being separated from their human family members can result in pets suffering marked anxiety due to separation distress. While emergency boarding may keep pets physically safe from harm and provided with the required freedoms of animal welfare, the emotional distress of an animal separated from its bonded family should not be underestimated. And this is particularly so, or maybe particularly so, for pets coming from domestic violence situations where the impact of prior trauma can be far-reaching. Despite best practice procedures for intake and husbandry at shelters, any large group of animals housed together experiencing the stress of transition and with sometimes unknown health history will be potential reservoirs for a variety of pathogens, including viruses, bacteria, and parasites. Surrender or boarding can expose bonded pets to a variety of diseases which they are less likely to experience if they are sheltered with their human families. And for the shelter, and this is the animal shelter, emergency boarding can also put strain on their capacity for care. It is not unrealistic to say that most shelters' housing will be occupied at any given time. To set aside a housing unit for emergency boarding for 2 weeks could mean reducing that shelter's life-saving capacity, in some cases quite dramatically. Also, the biggest risk factor for shelter euthanasia is entering the shelter in the first place. Any programming that seeks to divert shelter intake should be considered as life-saving. While there may be instances where surrender is the best option for both the person and their pet, supporting the relationship so that bonded families can take advantage of social housing should be offered if possible. So what are the current models of care for people and pets in situations of housing insecurity due to domestic violence or at risk of homelessness? Emergency support for people and pets can be considered as a spectrum of care from no intervention at one hand to the ideal goal of long-term pet-friendly housing at the other. Along this spectrum of support, services can include outreach support for rough sleepers, providing food and veterinary care for street sleepers, aiding surrender of pets so that rough sleepers can seek accommodation, emergency boarding and fostering for pets while people enter crisis accommodation, co-sheltering, and transitional and pet-friendly longer-term social housing. The goal of all of these support networks is to connect people with longer-term housing. And there may be a different right for each situation, and the particular right for a situation or a person and their pet may vary and may kind of move along this spectrum depending on what their unique set of circumstances is. But in general, higher order strategies will be sensitive to both the human-animal bond and improving welfare of both pets and people, whereas lower order strategies may address one of these perspectives at the expense of another. So at the moment, co-sheltering is receiving real traction in the US and Canada through the work of organisations such as Maddie's Fund, the Co-Sheltering Collaborative and Community Veterinary Outreach. The concept of keeping pets and people together in emergency housing is finding itself in the mainframe of social housing services. The research behind the Keeping Pets and People Together document produced by PetSmart Charities provided a framework for understanding that the need was there. This document revealed 10% of the homeless population in the US are pet owners. Further research supported by Maddie's Fund has produced a qualitative report on co-sheltering, which involved 4 organisations over 6 sites. And Maddie's Fund's also really active in promoting webinars on this topic as well. The Co-Sheltering Collaborative is an amazing organisation drawing together people in the social services, sheltering and veterinary fields. And they have a 3-day conference yearly and regular meeting hubs, which are usually online. Some of these are face-to-face and site visits, but a lot of their meetings are online and can be attended from the other side of the world. And they provide an avenue for sharing information, research and ideas. A number of resources have been produced by these organisations to support transition to pet-friendly sheltering. And these include the Centre for Veterinary Outreach's Animal Care Guidelines for Emergency Co-Sheltering, which can be downloaded from their website. There's also a pocket version, which is like a shortcut version of the main documents. Guidelines and administrative help, such as pro formas for pet agreements, can also be accessed at the Safety Shelter website. In addition, the lived experience of low barrier shelters, such as the Catholic Charities of Santa Rosa and Father Joe's Villages, has helped propel this momentum. So these groundbreaking organisations have shown that co-sheltering can work and that perceived barriers are not insurmountable. And there's been a very recent development in the US, which has been the introduction in June of the PUP Act, which is the Providing for Unhoused People with Pets Act 2023, to Parliament by Congressman Jason Crow. This bipartisan legislation seeks to remove barriers to co-sheltering by authorising grants for acquiring, renovating and constructing pet-friendly housing. This bill was introduced to Parliament alongside the Pets Belong with Families Act, which seeks to prohibit breed restrictions in public housing. So co-sheltering is clearly in an active space right now in the US and Canada, but what about the situation in Australia? The issues of homelessness, domestic violence and pet ownership have received recent media attention. There have been major changes in legislation in this space in various states in Australia. In November 2020, Domestic Violence New South Wales published a report on the link between domestic violence and animal abuse. 12 key recommendations were made, with the overarching recommendation that law, policy and program responses should improve access to a range of supports for people and animals experiencing domestic violence, with priority to those programs which kept people and animals together. Grants released following this report have allowed organisations such as RSPCA New South Wales Safe Families to begin advocating in this space, acting as consultants for domestic violence shelters wanting to allow animals on site. Recent legislative change in Victoria to the Residential Tenancies Act of 1997 has reduced barriers to pet ownership and rental accommodation, including public housing. Landlords must now apply to the Civil Administrative Tribunal if they wish to object to a tenant having a pet. While this may not stop landlords discriminating against pet owners by preferencing pet-free applications for new rental properties, it is a step in the right direction. And a recent victory for animal welfare in Victoria has seen a motion passed to change the status of animals in domestic violence situations, so they're no longer considered property and are protected as victims under the Family Protection Act. So what does this translate to in terms of boots on the ground? The answer is not sure. The data isn't there. Unlike the US, the demographics of pet ownership haven't been analysed in a general population, let alone pet ownership of the homeless population. Social housing is not centralised and no one agency handles this process. There is chatter in the media surrounding these issues about keeping pets and people together, but who is actually doing it? So to gain a clearer understanding of what was happening in Australia, the data has to be collected. So as part of my capstone project, we sent a survey on co-sheltering practices to over 60 providers of crisis and domestic violence accommodation throughout Australia, which sounds quite straightforward, but because it was an international, it was quite a process getting ethics approval from a US university to do a survey in Australia. It's quite complex. The aim of the survey was to understand how common co-sheltering was in Australia, what types of pets and people were accommodated, what the perceived barriers were, and what support was needed to facilitate this in our communities if we were going to try and get better at it. So when this survey was live, there was a declared national state of emergency along the East Coast due to flooding events, which saw thousands of residents displaced and social services overwhelmed with responding to this emergency. So the low number of responses from this area in terms of disaster response is likely due to the need for action superseding the opportunity to reflect on it. And it would be, I think, really good to repeat or resend out this survey now. So at the time of writing, 29 responses were recorded, and 86% of these were from Victoria and the rest from New South Wales, Western Australia and the ACT. The majority of shelters were located in urban or suburban areas, with the remaining being regional. 63% of housing providers described their service as emergency or crisis housing, 10.5% as domestic family violence shelters, and the remaining were transitional shelters and referral services. No disaster response or pop-up shelters responded, as mentioned previously, and this group is actually very hard to target due to their transitory nature. Just under half of the services that responded catered to singles, with the remaining split evenly between couples and families. The most common animals accepted were dogs and cats, although 6 shelters accepted birds and another 4 were pocket pet friendly. And not surprisingly, 75% of housing was categorised as existing housing modified to accommodate pets, rather than designated animal housing or shelters that were specifically built to accommodate animals. This was very surprising. Of the survey respondents, 50% offered co-sheltering opportunities. So this was a big surprise, as talking to social workers and others working in the field. The perception is definitely that placing clients with animals in supported housing is really difficult. So what exactly does this number mean? We need to bear in mind that subject selection was not a randomised process here. The recruitment of the shelters was really tricky, there being no centralised list, although some online sites were very helpful. So, you know, biased sample selection is definitely has to be considered as a reason for this statistic. Also, it could be that co-sheltering establishments were more likely to respond to the survey request than those that don't co-shelter, as they already felt invested or interested in the field. I mean, the third thing that I really had to consider was, could this prevalence be a true reflection of what is actually happening in Australia? And it's just that social service workers don't know that it's actually out there. After all, at least 15 shelters from this initial sample are already accepting animals. Talking to the RSPCA New South Wales Safe Families program, when they advertised their consultancy services, they discovered shelters already out in the community that were animal friendly, which they just didn't know about. Certainly in the Maddie's Fund report, there was a lack of knowledge amongst the homeless population about shelters that would accept them with their animals. So maybe we just need to talk more about it to the right people. Maybe an even more powerful number was that 80% of shelters not currently accepting animals stated that they would transition to co-sheltering if support was available. So this gives a really powerful indication of the willingness of the field to embrace this idea. And I think this is where we really need to work in this space. Affecting lasting social change often requires confronting barriers. In the survey, we considered barriers to housing from a dual perspective. From those shelters who were yet to make the leap, we asked what barriers they felt they were facing to do it. From those providers who had already transitioned to pet-friendly models, we asked what were the biggest hurdles that they actually had to overcome to achieve it. For those shelters that didn't accept animals, a range of different barriers were expected. Financial constraints and resistance from non-pet owning clients and staff were seen as an issue. Other issues raised include the concern that clients already had difficulty looking after themselves, let alone their animals. And we know now from the Journal of Preventative Vet Medicine, this is not actually true. Other problems raised were that pets were unlikely to be approved by the health department. One shelter mentioned the cultural conflict they were concerned would occur if pets were brought into their open layout dormitory setting. The most common barrier reported by co-sheltering establishments, so this was shelters that were already accepting animals, was a lack of animal-specific knowledge. Resistance from management was also identified as an issue. A unifying thread throughout these barriers is that there is a lack of knowledge. Knowledge about how to care for animals, knowledge about regulations governing animals in shared spaces, and about the behaviour or ability of their clients to care for animals. Knowledge about how inexpensive the transition could be and how to modify existing spaces to suit a new purpose. So is it enough to just know? The next question this brought me to was, what can we do with this information to help? Which I think is a particularly important question when you look at the statistic that many emergency shelters are open to this idea of co-sheltering. How can we help facilitate this? How can we identify the missing links and then take action to help? Partly, you know, research can speak for itself. Talking isn't meaningless. So every time the topic is discussed, the concept spreads. Raising awareness and getting people to talk about this model of care is a really important first step. During the process of recruiting participants for the survey, I had countless conversations with really lovely people in the social services field who really connected with this idea and wanted to know more. Perhaps the most important finding so far is that the great majority of surveyed shelters were keen to follow this model of care. All respondents were asked to brainstorm supports that they thought they would need to make this leap of faith and overcome the barriers they faced. Common themes among the suggested supports from both shelters who do and don't currently co-shelter included collaboration and education. So this is where I think we come in as animal welfare advocates and experts in the field of animal care. Collaboration can include helping shelters connect with animal welfare organisations, with behaviourists and trainers, and with for-profit veterinarians in the local area. It could also mean introducing shelters to already existing resources, such as low or no-cost veterinary services and pet food pantries. Education can include talking to shelters about the online support from organisations such as the Co-Sheltering Collaborative, awareness of support in the local area from animal management and welfare organisations who could help provide staff with training in animal behaviour and basic pet health, safety around animals, and managing conflict over pets in the community space. Making a list of pet-friendly sheltering options in your local area and making sure that vet clinics, animal welfare organisations and social services know about these is another way we can help support by educating our community. And education can also include sharing stories from organisations who already follow the model as learning from others, including both their wins and their mistakes, is a really important learning tool. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel here, just keep it oiled and keep it rolling. So interestingly, funding as a desirable support was mentioned numerous times by shelters who don't currently accept pets and not at all by those who do. Perhaps financial concerns shouldn't be viewed as such a barrier, as conversion of properties to pet-friendly status does not necessarily have to be expensive and resource heavy. While designated animal housing and fenced-off play areas might be a desirable end goal, co-sheltering can start with a few crates, litter boxes, food and cleaning products. So just to give an example of how animal welfare advocates, including veterinarians and animal management officers, can work in with social services in your local community. Our clinic works with a housing provider in our local council area, which has 13 pet-friendly rooms in their crisis unit. We provide veterinary assessments for pets entering accommodation, which might start as a conversation with an owner over the phone and then a follow-up appointment face-to-face to help with any immediate health requirements. We also link in with a council grant program to provide free desexing, vaccination, microchipping and worming if these services are required. AMOs will pick up pets and deliver them back following desexing if transport is a barrier. We have an agreement to provide discounted veterinary services for pets while they're staying in crisis accommodation if this is needed. We also offer our services as experts in animal health for the organisation when they are reviewing their policies on pets, and have made ourselves available to provide staff training if needed. So these services actually place very little strain on our private veterinary practice, but the key is communication and ensuring that all staff understand that crisis accommodation is just that, so that if intake assessments are needed, time is key. And so we try to get back to and complete any requests for assessments within hours rather than days. And so that's the end of my presentation. Just to give you, I guess, a summary of where we're at now and maybe some ideas about where we might be able to move to in the future. And if anyone has any inquiries or wanted to follow up or wanted some more information about any of those organisations that I've mentioned today, please feel free to email me. And I am now going to hopefully turn back on my video and see if we can get Nell back in here if anyone has any questions.
I'm here. I'm here, but I'm still not brave enough to touch my camera. So I'm going to leave that off.
Do you want me to do something?
Look, that was a brilliant presentation. Thank you for the overview, because I think coming that took us the whole way through, you know, from your learning about this, what the resources were available for you as a professional in the area, and now to what you can deliver. It really highlighted those collaborative relationships on a local level between local government, private veterinarians, and, you know, if possible, animal welfare organisations or sheltering organisations are the backbone of any, you know, of this sort of proactive work, if it's going to be done. And so often we don't leverage those possibilities. You know, we don't see those really strong collaborations in our communities, in our local government areas. So thank you for the work that you do. That is very inspiring. It immediately took me to thinking about co-sheltering in an emergency management capacity. You know, I think Hurricane Katrina really showed us how important it was, and certainly showed the United States how important it was to keep people and pets together. And, you know, the legislation that they put in place after Katrina really paved the way for a lot of work done around the world, and certainly got us thinking about how we do emergency management differently and better here in terms of keeping people and their pets together. And it's definitely possible with those collaborative relationships.
I think so. And I think, you know, what you've said really resonates to me is that there's so much learning out there. There's so much experience out there. And just to kind of to know that there's a lot of resources that have been developed already that we can kind of draw into our local situation and use for ourselves, I think is just so important.
Absolutely, because none of us have time, as you say, to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to develop policies, you know, from scratch. We don't need to develop, you know, whatever the resources are from scratch, because most likely there is somebody out there already working on that topic, and we can pick up on all of the hard work that they've done, and there is nothing wrong with that.
That's exactly right. I
Yeah,
think I think a
sorry,
lot
go on.
of the issues, I mean, just speaking for what, you know, the people that I've spoken to over the time doing this research and working with our local providers, I mean, I think it's just that fear of the unknown, of actually launching into a new space. And it doesn't have to be like that. You know, there is, you know, as you said, there are relationships that can be formed to kind of form a safety net so that it doesn't have to be so scary. And there are people, again, who've done it before, who can say, well, you know, if you're worried about this, this is how we approached it. So yeah, opening that conversation up.
Absolutely. And really having a look at what resources are available, what organisations, what individuals are available within your local community, getting everyone together around a table and saying, okay, what are your strengths? What can you bring to this picture? And perhaps we can match that with this particular strength. And suddenly you've got some kind of working model that really provides a what the community needs and fills a gap.
Yeah.
And in terms of emergency management, we've now seen so much. There's a lot of evidence out there, and we've seen it in practical applications, that we can get people through the different phases after an emergency into recovery much, much quicker if we can keep the whole family together.
Yeah, that's right.
That then is so much more resource effective for us as local government, other community service providers, if we can get people up on their feet, operating and being less reliant on the services that we provide. That's our ultimate goal, isn't it?
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So, look, this has been fantastic. I really want to explore this topic a lot more, and perhaps this is a good segue. We can explore it more at the Big Hairy People and Pets Summit and Workshops that AIM is collaborating on this year with G2Z and AMRIC. It's running the 10th to the 14th of October on the Gold Coast, and we will be opening early bird registrations and call for abstracts. So that's inviting people to submit to present at the event. So please keep an eye on our e-news and social media channels for more updates. But I really think that this is a topic that would be fabulous to explore more in that setting, because having all of the associated sectors together, which we have the opportunity to have this year with G2Z, AIM and AMRIC together, is just a perfect fit, I think. So thank you so much, Bec. I really appreciate it. Appreciate your time. Appreciate your patience with all of the struggles that we've had. The recording of this webinar will be accessible via our website to all members to watch anytime, and that'll be up in the next day or two. I know that Bec has her contact details there, so please reach out. She's very giving and generous with her time, and is obviously very passionate about this issue. And I love to see, you know, service providers, for-profit service providers getting involved in these kinds of spaces. So thank you very much again. And hopefully we will see you all on the Gold Coast in October. And yeah, appreciate your time and your patience. Thanks so much, Bec.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Mel.
Bye-bye.
See ya.